and considering just how a private letter, or indeed letters overall, capture moments in time, capture history, are chronicles of an age, but also an insight into thoughts, feelings and opinions of an individual. That is perhaps even more true for a diary. A diary is a microscopic view into a moment in time, a person's heart and soul, and tells us so much about an individual. This afternoon, it's 12 o'clock. This afternoon we are going to be having a conversation about these much anticipated, much awaited diaries. The diaries of one of our most famous actors, Richard Burton, whose life off stage is perhaps as reported as his life on stage and screen. And these diaries are tremendous because it's his life in his own words, which is a rare thing. I am absolutely delighted this morning to be able to introduce you to a group of people who are extremely well qualified to come and talk about Richard Burton on his behalf and on their own behalves as well. Ladies and gentlemen, in no particular order, may I introduce our panel. First of all, Rhiannon Williams, who was Richard Burton's niece, but in fact his little sister, Rhiannon. James. Rhiannon James. Oh, Williams. Oh. Sorry. I'm getting my Welsh names mixed up. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know why I said that. That's all right. Oh, Rhiannon James. Next, we have historian Christopher Williams. Christopher, is that right?
Only my mum calls me Christopher.
Okay. Who is responsible for this great labour of love? And now my heart is beating because this next gentleman has so many names, which I know about, but he's one of our most acclaimed and revered actors, the lovely Robert Hardy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome. We are going to be hearing from each of our panel individually. We'd just like to begin a conversation about the whole nature of diary writing. Chris, you're a historian. Diaries have been written by individuals since time began. What do you think our human need is to write about ourselves on a piece of paper?
Well, I think some of it is that probably all of us feel, quite rightly, that we have lives that are worth recording, that are interesting, if only to our own selves, and that there is some purpose, therefore, in keeping a record of what we do and what we think. Of course, people who are, in a sense, famous for something may well think that there is an audience for their diary. They may well be writing for posterity. One can identify a number of leading politicians, for example, in recent years, who have kept diaries as a kind of means, I suppose, of distancing themselves from the events in which they were embroiled, and also with a view to making some money later on. So I think it varies enormously from individual to individual. I think in Richard Burton's case, he kept different diaries for different purposes. So, for example, the diaries that form the bulk of the book, which start in 1965, go on to 1972, I think he kept those as a way of grounding himself, his knowledge of what was happening to him, of reflecting on his character and his world. And also, I think he did it to try to practice his skills as a writer, because he did have this great ambition to produce a work of literature of some kind. But then if you look at, say, the 1975 diary, which is one of the shortest diaries, he wasn't practicing his writing there. He is simply noting down what was going on. And I think that's, in a way, a time in his life when he'd come quite close to self-destruction in the early 1970s. And this was a way of kind of making sure that he was monitoring what he was doing in terms of his consumption of alcohol and the different relationships that he was embroiled in at that point.
Let's now just continue through the Richard Burton diaries, but sort of presenting his life perhaps in a more come-to-life fashion. Rhiannon, you had a very close relationship with Richard for all of your life, especially your childhood.
Yes.
And it would be fascinating to know more about that. You are younger by 6 years
Yes.
than Richard. What are your recollections of that early Richard?
My earliest recollection is of falling through a pushchair. So I must have been quite small. I suppose it was one of these Rexine type of pushchairs that was like a deck chair on wheels then. We just folded them up, not like the great big wagons you see these days. And I think I was one child too many. And I went through, and all I remember is being wedged, and he couldn't get me out. We'd only gone a few yards from home, and he had to take me home. I'm sure he was very glad, because he broke down. Other memories, later on, he was very good at storytelling. And Marion, my sister, who's 3 years older than I am, so there's Richard, Marion, and me. We begged him to tell us a story. My parents went out, usually just to choir practice, something chapel. Tell us a story. We knew it was going to be a ghost story. And we were always petrified at the end. And then the next time he would say, tell us a ghost story. And one night, this was a wonderful production. We must have been very, very young, because he came in with a sheet over his head and a torch inside his mouth. And we knew it was Rich, but we were cowering in the corner. And my parents used to get so upset to see us in this state just before going to bed. But they asked for stories, and these are the stories I like. So they were very, very good. Later on, he helped me a lot with my homework. He was seen to me to be very clever. He and Marion were bookworms. Whenever they were in the house, no television, of course. They were always like this. And I know my sister has told me that I was a real pain, because they want to read the book, and they said, we'll finish the chapter first, because I would have Ludo, Snakes and Ladders, Snap, ready to play. And they would say, when we finish the chapter, and I would stand about 2 inches away, either from Rich or Marion, with my games, waiting, and say, have you finished the chapter yet? And Marion said she wanted to kill me so many times, and I no doubt Rich did too. Then later on, 15, he was very, very good at school, but always correcting me. I asked to be corrected, but it used to be very, very irritating. My pronunciation. Once I said pronunciation. That was terrible. That was art. And when he came home one day from school, he lived in Mr. Burton's house. Mr. Burton had 2 rooms in this rented house. And Rich had to be vetted by a Mrs. Smith, the owner of the house, before she would accept him. So he went there for 1 year to prepare him for this exam for Oxford. And he came back after school to our house and said, I got into Oxford. I got into Oxford. We were all so excited. And I said, you've got into Oxford? And he said, no, I got into Oxford. And I said, yes, I know, Oxford. He said, no. You say Oxford, and you say Oxford. And I said, how do you pronounce Ford? And he said, F-O-R-D. And after ox, it's foot. And I said, what a crazy language.
The early diaries reveal him to be an incredibly active person right from the get-go, both academically active, intellectually, emotionally active, but also physically active as well. Can you remember that busy person?
Yes, very busy. Rugby in the winter, and cricket in the summer, and tennis as well. Our house had the park very nearby, so we had to go through the park to shortcut to school. And so he was often there. Oh yes, girls and boys. He was very popular with everyone, even the people in the street. And on Saturday mornings, he would run errands. He'd get tuppence or threepence, which was always very welcome. And one lady was known as God will pay you, my son. But you know, he was so kind-hearted We kept on running on the errands for her because we lived a quarter way up the mountain, and it was quite a, hike for someone. But the girls, my mother used to get so cross because she knew they weren't popping in to see her on the way home from school. And when he was 16, my mother had had enough and said, if you promise to meet a girl at the bandstand in the park, you keep your promise. She came today, her name was Phyllis, and she was crying because you said you'd arranged to meet her in the park. So Rich was 16, so the girl would be about 16. And I knew Phyllis, she was a lovely girl, marvellous red hair. And so he said, but I didn't arrange to meet her. We say to everybody, meet you at the bandstand, meet you at the putting green or whatever. And so she said, if you go on like this, you'll be married before you're 25. And he laughed. Anyway, that next day, and we were all in on this, he wrote a contract. I got the contract. I lost the contract for many, many years. And I think my daughters and husband here tonight, and they don't think they've seen it because when I knew I was coming here, I had a good clean out of my files. And this was so small, I haven't been able to find it for years. It had slipped under one of the file boxes. And it was like folded up like that. And it has brown tape sealing it, and it must have been the blackout tape because they didn't have masking tape in those days. And what does that say, Chris?
That says to be opened only on the 10th day of November 1950, and it's dated the 15th of May 1949.
This is the contract, but we all laughed at this, my father, my mother, but we went along with it, or at least I had no say in this. I hereby declare that on the 25th birthday of my brother Richard Walter Jenkins, I will bequeath to him the sum of £5, and then in brackets in words, £5 money, if the aforesaid R.W. Jenkins is freed of all matrimonial connections. Signature in brackets, C. James, that's my mother, Cecilia, witness Richard Jenkins. And I only recently found that, and I am so, so delighted. It's falling apart. I don't know if I should keep it folded or open it up.
I can take it away and take it to the archives.
You will do no such thing. And that's a piece of treasure indeed. You mentioned your mum, Cicely, there, who was Richard's sister, whom he had a huge affection for. And I believe you would like to read out a little section from the Christmas story.
Yes, my mother made Marion, my sister, Rich and me feel very special. She had a very special gift of making us think we were very, very important individually. And we all adored her, and Rich particularly so. He was very, very proud of her beauty, and she sang a lot as a child as well, and won many prizes at I Still Will Die. This is mostly fiction, but some of it is fact. The Christmas story, by the way, is should not have been in the religious section of the library in Berkeley. A friend of mine was working in the library in Berkeley and wrote and said, I'm cleaning up the shelves and I saw Richard Burton and I didn't know that he wrote about religion. So she said, I had a look at it and it is not. So I looked at it. So this is it. Now my sister was no ordinary woman.